Greetings, comrades! Today I'm going to follow up on a video that I made what feels like a million years ago, where I talked about the laws and systems of government within Game of Thrones. As I'm sure you know, it's a very feudal system. It's very technologically primitive, and because of this, we have a system of lords and ladies and kings and queens and all that sort of thing. As I discussed in that older video, it is a system that is built on the backs of the common people who produce labor and food and act as soldiers and very much work to support a system that really doesn't benefit them to any degree. If they have an issue, they can take it to their lord or their king and hope and pray that they may hear them out, possibly. It's a very unstructured system where the people in power hold pretty much all of the cards and can subjectively determine what is right and what is wrong. Given that fact, I expressed in that video that I was surprised that not many peasant revolutions have taken place in the world of Ice and Fire. Well, today I'm going to talk about all of the revolutions we currently know about on Westeros within the time span of the Targaryen dynasty. So the last 300 years of history within George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire series. I'm going to do things in a bit of a strange order in this video. I'm going to start with the main series itself, look at the instances of revolution as they've occurred there, and then look back at the history as it's laid out in the world of Ice and Fire, in Fire and Blood, and in all of the sources we have from George R. R. Martin. When looking at the bulk of this material, it's quite surprising how few revolutions or revolts or things similar to this have taken place. Specifically, there are only, I believe, 4, at least that I was able to find and classify as just full-on revolts or something similar. These 4, 2 of which happen in the main series, 2 of which happen a long time ago. One happens during the reign of Aenys and Maegor, one happens during the Dance of the Dragons, and then 2 happen during the reign of Joffrey and Tommen Baratheon. The first revolt is probably the most famous in the main series, that being the Riot at King's Landing that takes place in A Clash of Kings and in Game of Thrones Season 2. Joffrey Baratheon's sister, Myrcella, is shipped off to Dorne in order to secure an alliance and keep this fairly hostile power neutral during the War of the Five Kings. Tyrion Lannister is the one who organizes this, and him, as well as this entire procession of the royal family, goes to see her off at the docks at King's Landing. However, the city is in quite a bit of unrest. There's really no food to go around. Mace Tyrell, the Lord of Highgarden and commander of the Reach, has cut off all food supply to King's Landing, creating a pretty mass starvation epidemic at this point, as he is, at this stage, involved with Renly Baratheon's plot to seize the crown for himself. However, this riot itself doesn't start until the procession's return from seeing Myrcella off, where it begins in slightly different ways in the television show and in the book. Specifically, there's one event in the book that does not occur in the television show to spark this riot, that being the emergence of a woman from the crowds of commoners. This woman is holding a dead baby, assumedly her dead baby, and blocks the way for the royal procession. Sansa encourages the king to throw money to the woman, and he does, but she just ignores it. She continues to just yell at the king, and additionally, someone eventually throws dung at Joffrey. This happens at both the show and in the book, and he then orders Sandor Clegane and the rest of his guards to kill all of the common people surrounding his kind of procession back to the capital. From here, chaos erupts on the streets of King's Landing. Joffrey, the Queen, and Tyrion flee immediately back to the Red Keep, which is seen in the show as well. However, a number of people are left behind. The High Septon's litter is kind of toppled over, and because of this, a member of the Kingsguard, Sir Preston Greenfield, goes to aid him. Both Preston and the High Septon are torn to shreds by the crowd, as well as the Master-at-Arms of the Red Keep, Sir Aron Sansagar. Sansa Stark is also left behind in the hurry. However, Sandor Clegane remains and is able to save her from the crowd, kind of cementing to the reader that Sandor might be at least somewhat of a decent person or have somewhat of a heart. After this event, a curfew is set in King's Landing in order to ensure peace can continue throughout this time of war and starvation. It's an event that leaves a pretty lasting impact on the story and a number of elements thereof. A number of people have theories about who exactly caused it. I know Preston Jacobs has theorized that Littlefinger might have caused it to get rid of some people he didn't like. I've also read people think that Varys might have had something to do with it, specifically with the disappearance of a certain young stallion. Jaime even thinks this himself in A Feast for Crows, that Varys might have stolen away Tyrek in order to gain some sort of power over the Lannisters. But given that Jaime is thinking that in the story, it's not really the most likely that that's necessarily the case, but I do think it would make a lot of sense for Varys to steal Tyrek in order to seize this moment of chaos and ensure that Aegon Targaryen the Sixth might have the support of the Lannisters should he need it and should Cersei prove unworkable. I'd say the Riot also has one slight good outcome, which is that Sir Balon Swan is ascended to the Kingsguard, and I've been getting a bit of a soft spot for Balon as these videos go on, as I've talked about it more than I anticipated. But the main purpose of this event is to kind of give more depth to the conflict that is the War of the Five Kings at this stage. The Lannisters have taken unpopular action after unpopular action, and when a regime does this, it makes sense that the peasantry would have something to say about it. They're starved, they have no resources, they are desperate for anything, and these people, these royals, are seen as the root of their problem. So of course they lash out. It does a lot to kind of add depth to Tyrion's story in King's Landing throughout A Clash of Kings, as that city itself serves as kind of a character in this conflict, as it is the center and the heart of Tyrion's story for both his arrival as Hand and later through the Battle of the Blackwater. It's this very kind of alive setting that I really enjoy, and it's part of what I really like of Martin's work. It feels as though there is some response by the common people, and that is very much what happens in reality, lending this kind of feel of realism to the setting. The next instance of the small folk exerting their will isn't necessarily a riot or revolution as this last one was, but rather something a bit more subtle. The Sparrow Movement is something we begin to see in A Feast for Crows, and it grows more and more powerful throughout that book. That being a movement of common people who are essentially very invested in the faith and are trying to assert their kind of will and the idea that the gods will look out for all people rather than just those in power. We see this as mostly a response to the War of the Five Kings. This war wreaked havoc in the Riverlands, and given the fact that a lot of that area was burned and sacked and pillaged by soldiers on all sides of the conflict, it very much makes sense that the peasantry would have something to say about that. They have very much had nothing for this entire time, and it makes sense that in a time where individuals really have nothing, they would turn simply to their faith and look to God for some sort of sign or message to allow them to gain some more control over their life. It is this movement that eventually puts the High Sparrow in power. Something that I'd actually forgotten on my initial read of the book and going back and researching for this video is that the Moon Boy is the one who actually gives the High Sparrow the name the High Sparrow in the story, which is pretty neat. Love to see the Moon Boy's impact wherever you can, but the High Sparrow does have a massive impact on A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons. In exchange for forgiving the crown's debt to the faith, the High Sparrow is able to get Cersei Lannister to repeal King Maegor's law, that being the law against the faith militant arming themselves. We'll get to the reason for that in a little bit, as I'm sure you can guess that's another revolution type thing, but this has a massive impact. Previously, these small folk were only able to be kind of armed and used as a cause by the lords who would take advantage of their labor and of their service to die in hopes to advance some cause that they really had no relation to. In this case, the High Sparrow is able to create kind of his own army and hopefully enforce the will of the people, something that really hasn't been done in the history of Westeros before. This is something that really couldn't have been possible in past eras, as the previous rulers of Westeros did have dragons, and it's harder to revolt against people if those people have flying lizard nukes. But yeah, it's something that very much is only possible because of the interregnum the Lannisters find themselves in towards the end of A Feast for Crows, with the death of Tywin and the just general unrest in the populace. It's also worth noting that in the show, the layer of realism of having the people respond to the actions of a monarch is very much removed by the end of the series. Specifically, we see Cersei blow up the High Sparrow, a ton of other sparrows, most of the Tyrells, and the Great Sept of Baelor, and this really has no response by the common people. It really doesn't make sense with what we've seen of this story so far, especially given that the Riot of King's Landing was so faithfully adapted in the show. It really doesn't make sense that the small folk would have nothing to say for this massively important individual being assassinated pretty blatantly by someone who immediately crowns herself queen. The small folk may soon find themselves a monarch who much more speaks to them than the Lannisters. The Lannisters have been seen as responsible for the War of the Five Kings, for the Red Wedding, and overall just are these massive villains in the eyes of the small folk for some unknown reason. Aegon VI Targaryen, however, acts as a restoration of a dynasty that, at least by its later years, worked in lockstep with the faith in order to ensure that the good of the people was supposedly ensured. Aegon seems like a pretty prime candidate to be supported by the Sparrows, by the High Sparrow, by pretty much most of the common people of King's Landing, at least as a just reprieve from the Lannister regime, as it is very unpopular at present. It was not popular in Clash of Kings, and it has only gotten worse since. Speaking of the Targaryen relationship with the faith, it wasn't always so great. I mentioned Maegor a little bit earlier, and he had some issues with the faith. Specifically, early on in the days of the Targaryens, the faith was pretty uncomfortable with this new regime. They've been a pretty big power in Westeros, as had the Maesters and the just order in Old Town with the High Towers, and they really weren't that comfortable with Aegon, but they kind of had to be comfortable because of his dragon. However, there are a number of issues that are raised that go on throughout Aegon's rule that build up in the reigns of his sons. First and foremost, Aenys, the first heir of Aegon the Conqueror, has a child, Rhaena, in the year 22 AC. This seems fine at a first glance, but the faith is really not happy with this, because this first child and new heir to the Iron Throne after Aenys is a woman, and this goes against typical Westerosi succession. Additionally, after this, Maegor takes another wife during the reign of Aenys I, and because of this, the faith is just greatly outraged. They push Aenys to exile his brother, and he does, and Maegor goes across the Narrow Sea with his dragon Balerion, an enemy of the faith. This does not fully appease them, however. Aenys' very short reign is troubled by the faith for its entire duration until he eventually dies in the year 41 AC. In the last days of Aenys' reign, he wed his daughter Rhaena and his son Aegon to one another. This set off the faith in a big way. High Septon specifically referred to Aenys as King Abomination, which is a term we hear a few times throughout the main series. I might actually make a video on that term. That's pretty interesting. But regardless, this is kind of the spark that leads to a larger conflict throughout the time of Maegor. Maegor returns to Westeros, is crowned by Visenya, and becomes king, very much against the will of Aenys and Aegon the Uncrowned, and the faith soon launches a rebellion against him. After being crowned, Maegor returned to King's Landing, where he was challenged by a number of knights and members of the faith as untrue as the King of Westeros. He then began a Trial of the Seven, which is a version of a trial by combat, but with 7 knights on each side. Every knight in this combat was killed except for Maegor, who was put into a 28-day coma. He was revived, probably by black magic via a woman named Taina of the Tower, but upon waking, he burns the Sept of Remembrance. This sept was kind of the precursor to the Great Sept of Baelor in King's Landing, as it was the largest religious site in the area. Number of people tried to flee from the flames, but they were slain by Maegor's archers, just to really make sure that everybody in the faith was going to suffer for putting Maegor into a very long coma. There are a number of theories as well that Maegor might not have been so cruel if not for the dark magic involved in his coma, or just the head trauma, but there really isn't a ton of evidence in either direction on that. This begins the pretty much most one-sided conflict in Westerosi history, as far as I'm aware. Maegor goes on a series of battles against the Faith and wins pretty much every one of them, because he has both a larger army that isn't mostly peasants and members of lordly houses that have forsaken their inheritance, and additionally he has dragons, which does tend to help against a cause that does not have dragons. He ends up returning to Old Town and essentially creates a new Order of the Faith, as the High Septon is killed very mysteriously by loyalists to Maegor in order to prevent Old Town from burning. He then installs a number of High Septons, known as the High Lickspittle in one case, and overall just creates this supposedly new Order of Faith to more support the Targaryen dynasty. However, there are still issues. There's a Septon named Septon Moon in the Kingswood and in the Riverlands, who is acting as sort of a continued threat to Maegor's rule, as he is preaching against him and kind of stirring up the common folk against this abomination king, just as his brother before him. This conflict eventually comes to a head, as Maegor's rule is very unpopular given the number of conflicts he has pursued and the number of individuals killed in those pursuits, and Maegor is eventually mysteriously slain on the Iron Throne itself. It's unclear if he took his own life, if someone came in and poisoned him, or killed him, or impaled him, or what have you. But at the end of this conflict, and at the beginning of the reign of King Jaehaerys I, the Faith agrees to set down their swords permanently and live in harmony with the crown, as the crown will protect the Faith, rather than attack it as it did in the days of Maegor. It's King Maegor's laws that officially essentially end the Faith militant, but it's worth noting that those laws weren't actually implemented until the reign of King Jaehaerys, so it's kind of a misnomer. The rebellions against Maegor are very interesting to me, as I see them as kind of an opposite to the current religious revival that's ongoing in A Song of Ice and Fire. The current revival seems to be this movement by and for the common people in order to preserve their rights against the established systems of government that are kind of perpetuated in Westeros time and time again. Whereas, I think that the rebellion against Maegor is kind of the opposite. The Targaryens represent this kind of upset to the status quo, and the Faith and the Hightowers and potentially the Maesters are using this kind of religious background in order to create this unrest against the King Maegor, who they disagree with because he threatens their power. It's very interesting. It strikes me as much more political than the current Sparrow Movement in the main series. Fair warning, this last section is going to have heavy spoilers for House of the Dragon's future, specifically if I had to guess Season 3. If you do not want to have House of the Dragon spoiled for you, I would highly suggest you click to the next section of this video and just overall enjoy the rest of it, but this is a very important part of the Dance of the Dragons that I would be remiss not to talk about. Specifically, the next and final revolt we will discuss is the storming of the Dragonpit. This takes place at precisely the halfway point of the Dance of the Dragons, when Queen Rhaenyra is in control of the Red Keep and of King's Landing. Queen Helaena Targaryen, wife of Aegon II, leaps from the towers of the Red Keep where she was confined to her death, inciting a massive mob to raise hell in outrage for her death, as she was quite beloved by the people of King's Landing. Specifically, this mob is incited further by an individual named the Shepherd, who directs the fury of the people towards a common target, that being the Dragonpit, where the Targaryens house all of their dragons. A number of them are currently there when this takes place. Specifically, the Shepherd says, to quote from Fire and Blood, "When dragons come, your flesh will burn and blister and turn to ash. Your wives will dance in gowns of fire, shrieking as they burn, lewd and naked underneath the flames. And you shall see your little children weeping, weeping till their eyes do melt and slide like jelly down their faces, till their pink flesh falls black and crackling from their bones. The stranger comes, he comes, he comes to scourge us for our sins. Prayers cannot stay his wrath, no more than tears can quench the flame of dragons. Only blood can do that. Your blood, my blood, their blood. There the demons dwell, up there. Fire and blood, blood and fire. This is their city. If you would make it yours, first you must destroy them. If you would cleanse yourself of sin, first you must bathe in dragon's blood. For only the blood can quench the fires of hell." That shit goes hard. The Shepherd rules, and I hope they adapt him well in the show, but eventually this crowd does descend on the Dragon Pit, where they kill 5 dragons. Shrykos, Morgul, Tyraxes, and Dreamfire are all bound in the Dragon Pit and killed there by the rioters. Syrax, the dragon of Queen Rhaenyra herself, is flown by her son Joffrey Valerion in order to hopefully quell the riot. However, partway through this journey through the sky, the young prince is bucked off the dragon where he falls to his death, and Syrax soon lands to kill a bunch of peasants and rioters, and eventually is torn apart by the mob herself. This is a massive turning point for the Dance of the Dragons, as it results in the death of not only a prince, but a number of dragons that are crucial to the cause of the Targaryens. Specifically to Rhaenyra's cause, though one of the dragons killed here is Dreamfire, a member of the Green faction. So overall, this is a massive blow to the Targaryen regime that is created essentially by the small folk, which is pretty impressive. It's interesting to see the peasants finally get to the point where they're able to snap and go against these dragons. The shepherd very correctly points out that this isn't their city, it's the dragon's city. As long as they live there, they will be their predominant power. It is them that will rule, not these individuals who are doing all of the work. Ever since Aegon came and created this city, they have just been kind of bowing before the dragons without a second thought. It makes sense, dragons can kill you and are very dangerous, and overall are very scary as well. They have a frightful presence in D&D for a reason. However, it is only through blood and sacrifice that that ideal is able to be realized, that the people will be able to live for themselves, to reclaim this city as their own, or claim it for the first time as Aegon founded it with dragons himself. It is this ideal that I am surprised the peasants did not come to earlier. Following the days of Aegon the Conqueror, there were times when the regime was weaker and had fewer dragons. If this was possible with the peasants and the number of dragons in the city, I think that it very much was possible before, but it took a massive war and a lot of loss in order to stir up the people of King's Landing and the people of Westeros to the point of taking definitive action against the rulers that have been crushing them for so long. We'll see if similar things end up happening in the second Dance of the Dragons in the Winds of Winter, but until then, it's unclear exactly where the story may go. Hi, this was a longer video than I've done in a while, but I'm done with finals, and I am back. I am going to be making a lot more content in the near future. House of the Dragon Season 2 is coming, and I hope you all will join me to continue to watch it. I really appreciate any support on the video. It is free, and liking the video and subscribing is always nice to do as well. What do you think of the uprisings in Westeros? I'd love to see your thoughts in the comments below. Be sure to do all that stuff. It helps support the channel and just generally makes me feel good. I have many more videos in the near future. I'll be streaming more, probably with Fantasy Haven. And additionally, I am still hard at work at my longest video ever. I'm currently recording this, I don't want to say the date because I don't want to date myself, but the day after I record this video, I'm going to start recording that one, and that one will probably end up being well over an hour long. So look forward to that. Goodbye, everyone. See you soon.